Welcome to my channel. Sit back and listen to the best true crime stories. Let's go.
The Art of the Police sketch. From terrible to great, we all realize that law enforcement often has to work with very little information and very unreliable witnesses. Detectives sometimes go out of their way to identify a suspect or victim. Of course, this is their job, and it is better to do something than to give up and sit flat on their ass. But sometimes their actions are more perplexing than understanding and approval. This short story is about just such cases. Ridiculous attempts by the police to identify the identity of an unknown victim and perpetrator. To tell the truth, it would be better if law enforcers did not publish such sketches and photos of recognized persons. In some cases these actions looked like mockery, in others clearly hindered the investigation. John Doe from Bibb County. One example of such dubious activity is the case of John Doe, whose body was found on March 27, 1961 in Bibb County, Alabama, USA. He was between 14 and 17 years old, and the kid was hitchhiking across America. The car he got into had an accident. It hit a bridge guardrail and fell into the Cahaba River. The driver survived, but the boy drowned. In addition to his clothes, he was carrying only a Timex wristwatch, a bag with shirts, pants, and household items, a brown satin wallet with no identification, and a pack of Pall Mall cigarettes with a South Carolina excise stamp. Identifying him was decidedly impossible. His short stature, ordinary appearance, and an obscure RY plus love tattoo on his left forearm gave nothing away. So the police decided to publish a reconstructed portrait of him in the media, which, alas, looked more like a caricature than a picture of a human being. The most amazing thing is that in John Doe's wallet was a photo of him with some girl. And the posthumous photo could have been published as a last resort. But something absurd was presented to the public for identification, and is it any wonder that nobody ever identified the unknown deceased? Update 01/11/2021. John Doe of Bibb County has been identified. The teen's name is Daniel Paul Danny Ermintrout. He was 15 years old at the time of his death. Danny was born on December 28, 1945, in Miami. His parents, Father Alfred Valentine Ermintrout and Mother, Virginia Leocady Berner, divorced when Danny was young. Virginia soon remarried. Danny and his two brothers did not have the best relationship with their stepfather, and at the age of 15, Danny ran away from home. Incidentally, shortly after Danny left home, another brother also ran away. No one, by the way, still does not know where he is and whether he is alive. Another case of a very unsuccessful attempt to identify a dead person occurred in Spain in 1988. In this case, the police did not try to create a sketch of the unknown person, but showed his post-mortem photo to the public. This action turned out to be a fatal mistake, because the man died a horrible death, and it was clearly impossible to show it to people. The publication of the photo led to a lot of gossip, the invention of conspiracy theories, urban legends, and clearly delusional versions. When, many years later, the case of the unknown victim was solved, naturally everything turned out to be quite prosaic. One night in May 1988, the driver of a train traveling from Galicia to Madrid, in the darkness saw a man on the tracks. The unknown man was walking along the tracks, with his back to the train, waving his arms and not responding to the frantic horns of the driver. The collision could not be avoided, and, of course, the body of the strange man was badly mutilated. God only knows what idiot in the police department came up with the idea to publish gruesome photos of the victim. Warning. People who are not ready to see images of the mutilated body are not recommended to follow the link. What started after that? The published photos were used in shows about paranormal phenomena, where the man was called a vampire. From the collision with the train his teeth crumbled and looked like sharp fangs, a time traveler, a monster from another dimension. People looked at his wounds with fascination and came up with unbelievable theories. It was all disgusting and disgusting. And in 2009, the case was solved. Of course, the dead man turned out to be an ordinary man, not a monster. His name was Oscar Ortega Vassallo, and he was a 22-year-old retired military man suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Apparently, Oscar didn't know what he was doing when he found himself on the tracks. His inflamed mind may have been in other worlds and dimensions, but he was an ordinary man. And another thing, when he was alive, Oscar could be called a real handsome man. It is a pity that his death attracted the attention of not quite decent people, treating the misfortunes of others as entertainment. Even after Vassallo was identified, some people, firmly sitting on paranormal topics, continued to use his posthumous photos in their business. They came up with versions of, "The government deceived us again," looking for some mysterious symbols in the case. So the victim's mother even sued a few of them. It seems to have worked. Now there is almost no mention of the strange man on the tracks anywhere, except on very marginal sites. Paint to the rescue. You think sketches should be done by professionals. They are. But in 1994 the Cleveland police decided not to bother with the search for a specialist, and drew a portrait of the found John Doe with the help of MS Paint. On March 15, 1994, the remains of a black male, 50 to 70 years old, were found under a side road in Cleveland, Ohio. The body appeared to be in the final stages of decomposition, and the items found with it could not help identify the identity of John Doe. Alas, to this day, no one knows who he was. And I think, not the least role in this played a very unfortunate sketch of his appearance. Not even his own mother would have recognized the deceased. A cartoon thief. This story sounds like a joke. Reading it, it feels like someone is mocking you. According to Pennsylvania police, they were able to catch a vicious thief in 2018 based on a sketch drawn by a witness. On January 30, 2018, 44-year-old Hung Fucung Nguyen, I don't know how to spell that name correctly, pretended to be a market employee at Central Market in Lancaster Township, PA, and committed the theft of money from one of the outlets. The witness, who in this case was also the victim, said that he remembered the thief well and was ready to draw his portrait. He sat down comfortably, sharpened his marker and drew the appearance of his offender. Honestly, it's hard to imagine anything more comical. But you won't believe it, one of the policemen claimed that he recognized the suspect from this sketch. After that, catching him was a matter of technique. Suitcase business. I have not been able to find out who made this stupid sketch of the girl whose remains were found in the suitcase. All we know is that the sketch was released by the police. It is hard to understand how such a sketch could be published, because no person in the world can resemble what it depicts. Thank the gods, the case was solved rather quickly, and the unknown girl was identified. Her name was Jenny Games. Of course, when she was alive, Games' appearance had nothing in common with the disgusting drawing. The killer of the unfortunate girl was Stephen Zielik, a former Milwaukee police officer, whom the press dubbed the Wisconsin Suitcase Killer. Zielik was a regular on the Sandem website, where under the nickname Handcuffs, he looked for escort girls who agreed to act as submissive slaves during sexual games. It was on this site that he met 19-year-old Jenny Games and 37-year-old Laura Simonson. Games was murdered in Oregon in late 2012, Simonson in Minnesota in mid-2013. Zielik claimed he accidentally strangled both girls during sex. He put the bodies in 2 different suitcases and hid both of them in his house for a while. However, after a few months he decided to get rid of the bodies. He placed the suitcases in the trunk of a car and then dumped them on the side of a highway near the town of Geneva, Wisconsin. On June 5, 2014, a road worker discovered the suitcases and without opening them, clearly an experienced man who had seen a lot, immediately called the police. The police found black plastic bags in the suitcases and in them the remains of 2 women. Both were naked, with gags in their mouths and collars around their necks. Their hands were tied behind their backs and their faces showed signs of beatings. Laura Simonson was identified immediately from her dental records. But Jenny Games remained another Jane Doe until June 28, 2014. This gruesome sketch was created to identify her. Zielik was arrested on June 24, 2014 and confessed to both murders. Scarecrow, a somewhat similar story, but most likely without a possible just outcome. For more than 3 decades, Montana State Police tried to identify a woman whose skeletal remains were found by a bear hunter in the woods near the town of Missoula in 1985. This long unrecognized girl was then dubbed Jane Doe of Crystal Creek, after the area where the remains were found. And to try to identify her, they created this scarecrow. There's no other way to say it. Either this recreation was made by an anthropology major, or this grief-stricken specialist had crooked hands. But this scarecrow was more frightening than gave an idea of what the dead woman looked like. Besides, it somehow hinted that the girl had something Asian in her appearance. For several years now, the case of Jane Doe of Crystal Creek has been linked to serial killer Wayne Nathan Nance. Nance, dubbed the Missoula Torturer by the press, is suspected of committing at least 5 murders. Why only suspected? Because on September 6, 1986, he was killed by one of his potential victims in self-defense. It happened on the night of September 3. Nance, then working as a truck driver, showed up at the home of his co-worker, Doug Wells. Attacked him and his wife. Beat Doug, tied him up, dragged him into the basement, where he stabbed him in the chest. Confident that he had killed Wells, Nance went to the bedroom, where he intended to kill his wife as well. But Doug, badly wounded and bleeding, freed himself from his restraints, armed himself with a gun and followed the killer. A struggle ensued between them in the bedroom, and as a result, the maniac was killed. It is fair to say, at that time no one knew that Wayne Nance was a serial killer. Suspicions appeared later, when the police began to find out the circumstances of his attack on the Wellses, and of course to study the life of the criminal. At first, Nance was implicated in the murder of the Shooks. Then he was involved in the attack on the Pounds couple. In all 3 cases, the victims were tied up, beaten and killed in the same way. A search of Nance's home yielded horrifying results. He was found a lot of women's jewelry and strands of hair, hundreds of photos with unknown girls, whose fate could not be traced. There were also things stolen from the Shook couple, some of which Nance gave to his father George for Christmas 1985, that is, 2 weeks after the murder. Just at the time when Nance weaponized in Missoula, in the vicinity of the town were found several bodies of murdered girls, whose identity could not be established for a long time. The identification of some of them eventually took decades. In 2006, for example, DNA genealogy was used to identify a girl whom police called Debbie Deer Creek. She turned out to be 16-year-old Marcella Sherry Bachman of Vancouver, Washington, who ran away from home in March 1984 and went missing. For several years it was assumed that she was the victim of serial killer Gary Ridgway. However, it is possible that Wayne Nance killed her. In 2009, again with the help of DNA revealed the identity of the girl, who was called Betty Bevertail. She turned out to be 15-year-old Devonna Nelson from Seattle, who also ran away from home in the early 1980s. But in May of this year, 2021, Jane Doe of Crystal Creek was also identified. It turned out that the girl's name was Janet Lee Lucas. At the time of her death, she was 23 years old, and as you can see, thank for her identification is not a stuffed animal, but again, DNA technology. Janet was born in October 1960. She grew up in California, then lived in Washington. At the time of her disappearance she had a 5-year-old son, who, by the way, spent half his life looking for his missing mom. Until now, no one knows how Janet Lucas ended up near the town of Missoula. She never mentioned the name of the town or the state of Montana. How her remains ended up where they were found is a mystery. But at least now there was hope that the investigation into her death would move forward. And the parents are finally able to visit their daughter's grave. There's a good chance that Wayne Nance killed all the girls found in Missoula County. There is evidence that he frequented the places where the women's remains were eventually hidden. And although there's no way of knowing much now that he's dead, the police are keeping his case open. So there's still hope, albeit ghostly. Disfigured by the pattern, a remarkable story happened with the identification of 19-year-old Rit Sylvia Jurvetson. Her body was found in 1969 and for 46 years could not be identified because of the disgusting drawings, but finally she was identified by the drawing, but by a new one made in 2015. On November 16, 1969, the body of a white woman was discovered in a dense bush in a ravine off Mulholland Drive in Los Angeles, California. The corpse was discovered by a 15-year-old boy who was bird watching. The victim died of multiple stab wounds, more than 150, with a penknife to the chest, torso, and neck. According to the pathologist's report, she died elsewhere, about 2 days before the body was found, and she was thrown into the ravine, apparently by the killer who brought the corpse by car. No identification was found on the girl. They assumed from the clothes with foreign tags that she was a visitor, either from Canada or Spain. Then they drew sketches of her appearance, published in the media, and began to hope for a miracle. Meanwhile, the miracle did not happen, because these drawings from the word were not at all similar to the real appearance of the deceased. It would seem, an anthropologist did not need to recreate the image of the girl on the skull or mutilated face, the artist just needed to draw what he could see with his own eyes. At the very least, he should have published a posthumous photo, which, by the way, was available and looked passable. But for some reason, the unfortunate Jane Doe 59 did not receive the honor, and it should come as no surprise that for 46 years no one could identify her. For some time, police believed that Jane Doe 59 could have been another victim of the Manson family. First, her body was found about 10 kilometers from the home of Sharon Tate, who along with 4 of her friends had been murdered by members of the Manson family 3 months earlier. Secondly, there was evidence that a very similar girl named Sherry was seen at Spahn Ranch, where Manson and members of his cult lived. But the maniac flatly denied his acquaintance with the deceased, and proof of this police could not find. The case stalled, and almost 50 years dusted on the shelves of the archives of the Los Angeles Police Department. Then first in 2003 in one of the refrigerators of the Los Angeles Police found evidence in the case of Jane Doe 59, her bloody bra. DNA was isolated and uploaded to the National Database of Unidentified Missing Persons and NAMUS victims. And then in 2015, a member of the Doe Network Project, a nonprofit organization with volunteer workers, asked the police for Jane Doe 59's file, saw a post-mortem photo of the girl, and compared it to the sketch. It became abundantly clear to her that other sketches were urgently needed, to be done by a real artist. They were created and placed in the database. In June 2015, a friend of the Jurvetson family went to the pages of the Doe Network and accidentally saw these drawings. It seemed to him, the sketches are very similar to the missing 46 years ago Rit Sylvia, and therefore he immediately called her sister, and the latter has already contacted the Los Angeles police and sent her DNA. So the Jane Doe was identified. And her sister then gave several interviews, in which, albeit in a mild, but quite categorical form stated that the reason for such a long identification was disgustingly made earlier sketches. It turned out that in 1969 Rit, a Canadian of Estonian descent, traveled to the U.S. to meet some guy named either John or Jean. Jurvetson met him a few months before the murder when she worked at the Montreal post office. The young man appeared to be a medical student and had a French accent. He was described as handsome, looking like Jim Morrison of The Doors. Rit fell madly in love with him, but Jean left for California. So Rit decided to follow him. She scrupulously saved every penny of her paycheck to save up for a trip to America. And as soon as she could, she dropped everything and went after love. Whether she met Jean is unknown. She reported that she rented a small room at the inexpensive Paramount Hotel, demolished in 1985. Her last postcard to her parents was dated October 31, 1969, about 15 to 16 days before the murder. In it she wrote in Estonian, "Dear Mom and Dad, the weather is nice, the people are kind. I have a nice little apartment. I often go to the beach. Please write to me. Hugs Rit." Could John Doe be Rit's killer? However, police believe there is another person of interest in the Jurvetson murder, a roommate with whom Jean lived in Montreal. He was described as a short, good-looking young man in his 20s or 25s, with a Beatlesque haircut, who spoke almost no English, and his name also sounded something like Jean or John. In 1970, Gilda Green, a friend of Rit Sylvia's who had seen both John's jeans a couple of times in her day, while in Prague, Czech Republic, happened to meet a guy with a Beatles haircut in a cafe, and of course tried to find out the fate of the missing Jurvetson. The men told her that Rit had been living with him and his friend for a couple weeks in Los Angeles. She was doing great, but then she decided to go somewhere else and he doesn't know her current whereabouts. Alas, to this day, the police have never been able to identify both guys. Do you think if they had identified Rita Jurvetson back then, in 1969, and gotten descriptions of possible suspects, would this case would have been solved? Who knows? Stolen Innocence. These 3 sketches of a suspected pedophile and murderer were perfectly drawn, but as you can see, they depict 3 different people who look absolutely nothing like each other. That said, the witnesses and the victims were actually describing the same suspect. These, by the way, are not the only sketches done on him. There were others. Naturally, such sketches could not help in the investigation, but only confused and led the police to a dead end. There were many more sketches, of a man sneaking around, a man sitting in a car, and a man with a wild, piercing stare. The police even released a composite drawing that they, like Frankenstein, molded from 3 different sketches. In reality, the perpetrator looked like this. Are the witnesses and victims to blame for so inaccurately describing the pedophile to the artist? And try you, being in comfort and peace, that is, without feeling the fear and horror of the victim, looking at his photo, try to describe such a faceless man. What do you pick up on in his face? How old is he? How to describe his eyes and eyebrows? The nose? This scumbag's name is Danny James Heinrich. Between 1986 and 1987, he kidnapped and raped 5 boys, all under the age of 11. In January 1989, he attacked another boy, 12-year-old Jared Schuo. Threatened him with a gun and raped him, too. And 9 months later, on October 22, 1989, he attacked 3 boys at once, 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, his 10-year-old brother Trevor and their 12-year-old friend Aaron Larson. All 3 were riding their bikes home from the Tom Thumb Mini Mart in St. Joseph, Minnesota, where they had gone to rent videotapes. With a mask on his head and armed with an unloaded revolver, Heinrich ordered the boys to get off their bikes and lie face down on the ground. Then asked each one's age and looked into his face. He chose Jacob Wetterling and told the others to run without looking back or he would shoot them. Jacob was never seen alive again. His bones were found 48 kilometers from the place of abduction as early as September 1, 2016 after their location was reported by the perpetrator himself. Heinrich was suspected from the beginning of the investigation into the Wetterling kidnapping and was thought to be connected to the Jared Schuo case as well. The case was handled by the FBI, which came up with a suspect fairly quickly. But the surviving boys were afraid they couldn't identify the perpetrator. They were confused and confusing. The investigators had no evidence at all. The tire tracks found at the scene of Jacob Wetterling's abduction, the expert could not accurately identify, and there was nothing else to grab onto. Heinrich was hauled in for questioning, but could prove nothing. In 1994, U.S. Senator Dave Durenberger, precisely because of the Jacob Wetterling kidnapping, proposed the creation of a national registry of perpetrators of crimes against children, and Congress passed the law. This piece of legislation has gone down in American history as the Jacob Wetterling Act. Part of a larger violent crime bill, it required that anyone convicted of a felony against a minor or convicted of a felony sexual offense must register with police upon release from prison, and police were required to report to the local community where such offenders lived. It wasn't until 2015, thanks to improved technology for isolating DNA from tiny little samples, that evidence was dug up on Heinrich. They searched his home and found a wealth of evidence, personal belongings of the boys he raped, 19 folders of child pornography, handcuffs, duct tape, and the clothes the perpetrator wore. And numerous videos of other boys filmed surreptitiously on the street, stadium, and playgrounds. In 2016, the pedophile confessed to the rape of Jared Schuo and the murder of Jacob Wetterling. Only then were the unhappy parents allowed to give their son's remains a proper burial. In this case, as you can imagine, the sketches of a possible suspect played no role. On the contrary, shown to the public, they distracted detectives hundreds of times to verify false evidence. Ordinary citizens who wanted to help the investigation cut the police phone lines and reported that their neighbor, co-worker, classmate looked exactly like the sketch. It was impossible to ignore these signals, and months, years, money, and effort were spent on them. So maybe they shouldn't have been made. Or was there some sense in it? And now the successful sketches. No, I did not intend to talk only about failures. In any business there are some bigwigs, and I've told you about them above, but there are also unconditional talents. Lois Gibson is one such genius. An artist who has been on the police force for 30 years and has drawn over 1,000 absolutely amazing sketches, mostly of suspected criminals. Her drawings are really something. It seems as if she knew these people personally, or at the very least sketched their appearance from photographs. But in reality, Lois had never seen them, but used an unusual technique to talk to witnesses. Like Jean Boylan, another very successful artist who had helped the police on many occasions, she used trusted and hours-long conversations with witnesses to recreate the appearance of suspects. This unusual technique of recreating the memories of eyewitnesses in the 70s and 80s was invented by Jean Boylan, one of whose sketches you definitely know. Here it is, the world-famous drawing of the Unabomber's appearance. When the bomber was caught, it turned out that Boylan's drawing was a two-drop resemblance to the original's appearance. Police enlisted Jean Boylan to sketch the suspect as a last resort. The witness, who saw the Unabomber for no more than 2 minutes, had worked with 5 other artists up to that point, but each time was dissatisfied with the result. "You're not painting what I'm explaining," she raged, losing patience and hope. And then, 7 years after she saw the Unabomber, they decided to engage Jean, who worked very differently from other artists. It was like she was getting inside the heads of the witnesses, talking to them for hours. It was more like the work of a psychoanalyst than an artist. Jean had been a rape survivor in her youth and knew firsthand what it was like to try to explain to the police what the 2 men who had tortured her for hours looked like. The indifference in their eyes, looking at pictures of the typical ovals of faces, eyes, noses, ears, chins. This had no effect. The victim's consciousness displaced memories of the traumatic event, and nothing worthwhile came out with this approach. In her 20s, Boylan, who dreamed of becoming a journalist, began working as a civilian deputy for the Oregon Sheriff's Department, interviewing eyewitnesses. Dissatisfied with what the staff artists working with the police were doing, she began applying the psychology she was studying at the University of Oregon at the time to talking to witnesses. And after graduation, she joined the Portland Police Department to work full-time. Very quickly her drawings began to lead to arrests, and then Boylan was approached by the FBI. And so began her career of extracting from the subconscious of witnesses their worst memories. Boylan was so good at talking to people, getting into their state of mind, that they remembered even the smallest details. She realized that witnesses are almost always in a state of psychological trauma. Their minds actually remember many details, but stress often distorts them. These nuances can be recovered, but it has to be done very gently and sort of stealthily. No pressure, no pressure, no pressure, no questions that police officers often bombard a witness with. Did the suspect have a mustache, beard, and glasses? How old was he? What are the characteristic features? Height, weight, build. The piling up of these questions often makes a person's mind short-circuit. It also becomes susceptible to suggestion. He had a big nose, didn't he? Well, I guess so, thinks the witness, and so the first mistake is born. One by one it forms false memories, because almost all people traumatic events want to forget as soon as possible. So there are hastily constructed drawings that have little to do with reality. What people see is evidence as fragile and valuable as fingerprints. This evidence must be guarded with the utmost care, Boylan explains. Jean Boylan's method was not accepted by all law enforcement officers. Many thought that she worked like a psychic, not an artist, so she was often involved in the case only in extreme cases. But her work bore fruit, and a lot of it. In 1993, it was as if she herself was in the place of two girls who were tied up in the bedroom of their house armed with a knife. Maniac Richard Allen Davis, and then stole their friend, 12-year-old Polly Klaas. When the killer was caught, the sketch created by Jean was as if drawn from him, and meanwhile the artist made it only from the words of 12-year-old girls scared to death. No, it wasn't Boylan's drawing that led to the capture of Richard Allen Davis, who killed poor Polly. But FBI agent James Nelson, who worked on the case, was so impressed by the artist's work that he called it the best he'd ever seen. And in 1995, together with witnesses, Boylan got over their shock at seeing the torn bodies, the mixture of the smell of blood and bitter almonds. That's what nitromethane smells like, in Oklahoma City. She needed to get from witnesses an accurate description of the appearance of the two terrorists who detonated a 3,200-kilogram bomb and killed 168 people. The bombers turned out to be Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, but without knowing it at the time, Boylan drew them incredibly accurately. This sensual, beautiful, and intelligent woman has created more than 7,000 sketches of suspects in her career and has helped the police solve dozens of crimes. Using a very similar method, the artist I started talking about at the beginning of this chapter, Lois Gibson, also works. It's a strange coincidence, but like Jean Boyle, she was raped at the age of 25. She was attacked by a guy who abused the girl for half an hour, choking her, bringing her back to life and choking her again. He was caught, and Lois remembered well the sense of justice she felt when she saw a monster in human form go to jail for years to come. During her successful career as a police artist, Lois Gibson made it into the Guinness Book of World Records as the person who made the most incredibly accurate sketches of criminals and helped the police and FBI catch 751 suspects. I guess that's enough words, though. See her talent for yourself. Well, as you can see, this article can probably serve as a clear example of the undeniable truth: to make the world a better place, everyone just needs to do their job as well as possible. And do you know other examples of unsuccessful, and on the contrary, very realistic sketches of unknown victims and criminals? Share your knowledge. Let's make a collection of such works together.